Hi, in this class I'm gonna show you everything you need to know about the timeline to animate. In the timeline we can see the keyframes that we have created for each control or object. With the blue bar we can move forwards and backwards in time. With the central buttons we can play our animation normally or play it backwards. But keep in mind that this is not a reliable way to check the animation's timing, since it will not play it at 24 frames per second, and the speed will depend on how powerful your computer is and how complex is your animation. So if you want to have a reliable view, do a viewport render. The following buttons to both sides, as you already know, will jump from keyframe to keyframe. The following buttons to both sides will go to the beginning and the end of your animation. And as you know, the small circle is the Auto key, which you want to have activated. On the top right you can set the range of frames you will use to animate. But if you wanted to render only a portion of your animation, activate the clock icon and set the range you'd like to render. This can save you a lot of time, because if you're only working on one section of your animation, generally you don't want to wait for the entire animation to render. In this section here you can move back and forth on the timeline. Although you can do the same action much more effectively with the blue bar or the arrows of the keyboard. In the keying drop-down menu you will be able to establish the icon that the new keyframes you create will have. This is completely optional, but it can help you to have your timeline organized, since you can set different colors to easily differentiate between the main poses, breakdowns or wherever you want. Okay, next, if you want to create a new frame without modifying the control, just select the control and hit S. Keep in mind that if you have the mouse on the viewport, it will be created instantly. But if you have the mouse on the timeline, this message will appear. So just select all channels so that a keyframe is created on all the attributes. If you want to delete a keyframe, just select the keyframe, right-click, delete keyframe. If you want to select multiple keyframes, left-click and holding it, drag it over all the ones you want to select. You can also add or remove keyframes from the selection by holding Shift and clicking on the keyframe. If you want to move a keyframe, just select it and drag it wherever you want. But if you want to move several keyframes at the same time, once you have selected them, use the middle click to drag them. If you want to copy one or several keyframes and paste them at another time in your animation, select the keyframe where you want to paste it and press Ctrl V. Now, if you want to scale a group of keyframes so that they are proportionally separated or united, select them and press R. Scale them and do a left click to set them. But of course, keep in mind that depending on the frame you have selected when you press R, the point from which they will scale will change. That's it, this is all you need to know about the timeline. Hi, in this class I'm gonna show you everything you need to know about the graph editor. The graph editor is without a doubt the most powerful tool we animators have, since it allows us to see clearly the values that some keyframes have in relation to others, and allow us to visualize and modify what kind of transition they have between them. Therefore, the graph editor is an incredibly useful tool when animating and correcting mistakes. How to read the graph editor. Although at first it may be a little difficult to understand, with a little practice you'll become an expert. In the graph editor, the frames, in other words, the time, is represented horizontally. and the values, in other words, the movements, are represented vertically. Therefore, the more a curve moves up and down, the more it will move, rotate or scale the axis of the control you have selected. And the more it moves to the right, the longer it will take to complete the action. You won't be able to make the curve go backwards, since it wouldn't make any sense. And if the curve is completely flat, it means that there is no movement at all on that axis. Once we have selected the control that we want to animate or have animated, on the left side panel we'll have to click on the small arrow to display the 3 translation axes called location, the 3 rotation axes called all rotation, and the 3 scaling axes called scale. To move around in the graph editor, press and hold Alt plus middle click or left click. To zoom in and out, use the mouse wheel. And if you want to visually flatten or stretch the curves, hold Alt plus right click and use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out afterwards. Please note that this is purely visual in the graph editor and will not change anything in your animation. To move, rotate or scale the keyframes in the graph editor, first select the axis that you want to modify, then select the keyframe or keyframes, and just like in the viewport, we will select the tools we want to use. Then only by moving the mouse we'll modify the tangents, and when you are happy with your modification, just left click to key it. If you only wanted to adjust it horizontally or vertically, once you have selected the tool you want to use, move very slightly the mouse vertically or horizontally, and then do a middle click. This way it will only allow us to move it in that axis. And just like in the viewport, if we hold down Shift, they will move much less in relation to the movement of the mouse. And if we want, we can move the keyframe by selecting and moving them with the left click, and we can rotate them with the handles that appear when we select them. We can also lengthen or shorten the handles to modify the curves, and furthermore we can modify the types of handles. To do this, select the keyframe you want to modify, right click and go to handle type. As you can see, we have 5 options. 3 will separate both ends so that they move individually. Align will attach both sides back so that they move together. The vector type will also separate both sides, but will also make them straight lines. So from the moment it starts moving until the next keyframe, each frame will move exactly the same. The automatic type will attach both sides together, and will also create a clean flowing curve from keyframe to keyframe. Please note that when there are abrupt changes of direction, it will create curves that can sometimes be excessively large. And finally, auto-clamped will also make the curves flow, but making the handles flat and parallel to each other. So unlike the automatic type, the curves will never go beyond the keyframe. And therefore will leave a straight line between the keyframes that have exactly the same value. Also, we can modify the kind of general interpolation of the tangents. To do so, right-click and go to interpolation mode. You'll see that there are several options, but the most important are the first three. The others can be useful in some cases, but are not usually used. Constant will remove the transition between keyframe and keyframe. In other words, the pose will remain motionless until the next keyframe, and this is generally used on the blocking phase of your animation. Linear will create a straight line and symmetrical interpolation just as the vector handles. And Bezier will make a smooth transition between the keyframes, creating an acceleration period and a slowdown period. Keep in mind that since the graph editor represents the transition between keyframes, you can only see the curves of everything in which you have established at least one keyframe. For example, the properties attributes of the arms. Since keyframes won't be created on these attributes when you set a keyframe on the control. So you must go individually to the one you want to modify. Hover the mouse over it and press S to create its first keyframe. Now you can activate, deactivate and animate this attribute throughout your animation. Moreover, with the push pin you can keep on top the curves in the graph editor panel, which would be very useful if you need to have the curves of a specific control inside, so you can modify them at any time even if you have selected anything else. Above we have the normalize button. If we activate it, it will visually unite the curves. So if we have several curves away from each other, it will be much easier to work on them at the same time, since we won't have to be moving up and down through the graph editor continuously. And if we activate the little button on the right, it will also visually adjust the new changes we make on the curves. Although personally I prefer to have it disabled, since sometimes it can be a bit confusing, because when you move the keyframes they will visually rejoin the others. And finally, at the top right we have the Ghost Curves button. What it does is that if you activate it and modify a curve, it will show you how it was before the change. This is very useful when making changes or cleaning up the curves, as it will give you an exact reference so you can easily do even the smallest of the changes. That's it, this is all you need to know about the graph editor. So see you in the next class. Slow out, fast out, slow in, fast in. These are the terms used to indicate how each movement begins and ends. For example, here we have 5 balls that have exactly the same timing and spacing. Now what I will do is to modify the graph editor curves to show you what the different shapes of the curves represent on an object motion. As you see, by default curves are created with a slow out and a slow in. If we set the handles in vector mode, we will transform it to a straight line, and so the ball will move with an even spacing on all frames. In other words, the speed will be constant. So, compared to the other balls, at the beginning it will move faster since it doesn't have a slow out. In the middle of the animation, the other balls will reach the point of the curve where they accelerate, so they will advance to the lead. And finally, all the balls will reach the end on the same frame. The first one without slowing and the other ones with an slowing. Now I will modify the second one so it has a great slow out and a fast in. As you can see, the flatter the curve, the less the ball moves. And the more vertical it gets, the more it accelerates. In the third, I will do just the opposite to the previous one. It will start moving with a fast out and will stop with a slow in. In the fourth, I will also create a fast out, but this time I'll create a keyframe in the middle of the movement to flatten the curve, therefore reducing the speed of the ball. And at the end, I'll create a fast in. Keep in mind that we can always exaggerate its speed by stretching the handles and moving them up and down. And remember that if the curve changes direction, it means that the ball will change direction on that axis. And for the last ball, I'll create a slow out, and I will make the ball speed up to the last pose. But instead of hitting the pose in an abrupt manner with a fast in, we will create a few frames of caution. In other words, a very small slow in. And so we'll maintain the perception that the ball arrives at a high speed, but removing the stiffness of just a fast in. Okay, that's it for now. See you on the next class.